Harrison Ford didn't become a legend overnight. He stumbled into it, got rejected, and nearly written off entirely before the world figured out what it had. And when it finally did, everything changed. This is every era of Harrison Ford, the rises, the reinventions, and the moments that cemented him as one of the most enduring icons Hollywood has ever produced. The invisible years. Most people don't know Harrison Ford spent nearly a decade being absolutely nobody. He arrived in Hollywood in 1964 with a contract from Columbia Pictures, paying him $150 a week. He was young, lean, and had enough presence to get noticed, but not enough to get remembered. Columbia dropped him fast. Universal picked him up, then dropped him too. He was getting small roles, forgettable faces in forgettable films that nobody watched twice. He played a bellhop, a telegraph operator, a guy with 3 lines who disappeared before the second act. This is the era most biographies skip over because it's uncomfortable. It doesn't fit the legend, but it matters because it built the man. Ford wasn't precious about his dignity. He picked up carpentry to pay his bills. He learned the craft seriously, became genuinely skilled, and found work renovating homes and offices across Los Angeles. He wasn't waiting to be discovered. He was working, surviving, refusing to quit even when every reasonable person around him would have. There's something important in that.
I learned that craft was something that took long.
The entertainment industry is structured to break people who aren't immediately useful. Ford endured nearly a decade of that structure, telling him loudly and consistently that he wasn't the guy. He kept showing up anyway. That stubbornness, it would define everything that came after. American Graffiti and the Almost. In 1973, Ford landed a small role in American Graffiti, George Lucas's nostalgic ensemble coming-of-age film that became a massive cultural hit. Ford played Bob Falfa, a cocky street racer. It wasn't a starring role. It wasn't even close. But something about the way he carried himself on screen caught attention. People noticed. Lucas noticed. The film grossed over $140 million on a budget of $775,000. It was one of the most profitable films in history at that point, and Ford was part of it. A small part, yes. For the first time, Harrison Ford's name was attached to something that actually mattered. He didn't get rich or famous from it, but the door cracked open, and Ford was the kind of man who knew how to push a cracked door. Star Wars and the explosion. George Lucas called him back. Ford was working as a carpenter at the same studio where Lucas was conducting auditions for a science fiction film nobody believed in. Lucas needed someone to read lines opposite the actors auditioning for other roles. Ford was literally installing a door. Lucas pulled him in, and what happened next is mythology. Ford read Han Solo with the kind of effortless cool that nobody rehearses and nobody teaches. It was instinct. It was 10 years of rejection crystallized into a character who didn't trust the system and smirked at authority. Because Ford himself had spent a decade being dismissed by that exact same system. Star Wars released in May 1977 and detonated. The film made over $775 million worldwide. It changed cinema permanently. And Harrison Ford, the carpenter, the guy who'd been told repeatedly he didn't have it, was suddenly one of the most recognizable faces on the planet. Han Solo wasn't just a character. He was an attitude. Too cool to admit he cared, but always there when it counted. Ford made him real because he understood him. This was his era of arrival, sudden, explosive, and completely earned by everything that came before it. The double crown. If Star Wars made him a star, Raiders of the Lost Ark made him a star. That distinction matters. In 1981, Steven Spielberg and George Lucas introduced Indiana Jones, and the world lost its mind. Here was Ford again, but this time in leather and a fedora, cracking a whip, running from boulders, and somehow making archaeology feel like the most dangerous profession on Earth. The combination of Spielberg's direction and Ford's grounded physical performance created something audiences had never quite seen. Indiana Jones wasn't a superhero. He got hurt. He was terrified half the time and powered through anyway. Ford played fear better than almost any action star of his generation, and that's precisely why the action landed so hard. Now, Ford had 2 franchises, 2 iconic characters and cultural institutions. This simply didn't happen. Hollywood didn't produce dual icons of that magnitude from one actor in the same breath, but Ford wasn't reading from the Hollywood rulebook. He never had been. The early 80s were his peak commercial era, a period where everything he touched turned to gold. The Empire Strikes Back in 1980, Raiders in 1981, Blade Runner in 1982, Return of the Jedi in 1983, Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom in 1984. 5 landmark films in 5 years. The pace was relentless, and the cultural footprint was staggering. Blade Runner and the depth nobody expected. In the middle of all the action and mythology, Ford did something quietly extraordinary. Blade Runner wasn't a commercial success when it released. Audiences were confused. The film was dark, slow, and philosophically dense. Nothing like Han Solo, nothing like Indiana Jones. But Ford's performance as Rick Deckard was different, quieter, more internal. A man operating in moral shadow, hunting beings who might be more human than he was. Ford brought an exhaustion to Deckard that felt genuine, a weariness behind the eyes that suggested a man who'd seen too much and felt too little. Blade Runner became one of the most celebrated science fiction films ever made. Its reputation grew slowly over decades, reassessed and reevaluated until it stood as an absolute classic. Ford had delivered it during his busiest, most successful period, almost as if to remind everyone that there was an actor behind the icons, not just a face, not just a presence, an actor. The dramatic pivot. Ford understood something crucial that many action stars never figure out. Icons get trapped. The same quality that makes an audience love a character can quietly strangle a career if the actor doesn't push against it. Ford pushed. Hard. In 1985, he starred in Peter Weir's Witness, a quiet, tense thriller about a Philadelphia detective hiding in an Amish community. Ford was nominated for an Academy Award. The man behind Han Solo and Indiana Jones, nominated for playing a conflicted cop navigating pacifism and violence. It was a statement, a declaration that Ford refused to be defined by franchises. The Mosquito Coast in 1986 pushed even further, Ford playing a manic, failing idealist, dragging his family into disaster. It wasn't comfortable, it was deliberately difficult, and Ford committed to it fully. He was building something durable, not just a career fueled by franchise installments, but a genuine body of work that could hold up against scrutiny. Jack Ryan and the action reinvention. The 90s brought another reinvention. Ford stepped into the role of Jack Ryan, the CIA analyst turned reluctant hero originally portrayed by Alec Baldwin in The Hunt for Red October. In Patriot Games and Clear and Present Danger, Ford made Ryan his own, more grounded, more frustrated, the kind of intelligence operative who looked genuinely annoyed that the world kept requiring him to shoot people. Both films were enormous hits. Ford's instinct for grounded, believable heroism translated perfectly into the post-Cold War thriller landscape. He wasn't playing a superhero. He was playing a man trying desperately to do the right thing in a world determined to make that impossible. Then came The Fugitive in 1993, arguably his finest pure thriller performance. He played Dr. Richard Kimball, a man wrongly convicted of his wife's murder, hunted by a U.S. Marshal played by Tommy Lee Jones in an Oscar-winning performance. The film is tense, propulsive, and emotionally gripping. Ford anchors every frame with quiet, desperate determination. The Fugitive grossed nearly $370 million worldwide. It was proof, again, that Harrison Ford understood how to carry a film on his back. The cracks and the complexity. Nothing lasts forever in exactly the same form. The late 90s and early 2000s were complicated for Ford. Air Force One in 1997 was a massive hit. He played the President of the United States fighting terrorists aboard his plane, and it delivered everything audiences wanted. But the films that followed struggled to replicate that success. What Lies Beneath K-19, The Widowmaker, Hollywood Homicide, Firewall. These were films that underperformed, received mixed reviews, and began a slow conversation about whether Ford's era of dominance was fading. He was aging. The franchises were dormant. The dramatic pivot films weren't landing with the same force as Witness had. But Ford was never the type to panic publicly. He kept working, kept showing up as always. The Return and Reckoning. Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull in 2008 was a gamble. An aging Indiana Jones, decades removed from his last adventure, facing aliens and refrigerators and the complicated expectations of a generation that had grown up worshiping the originals. The response was mixed. Audiences came out in enormous numbers. The film grossed nearly $790 million, but the critical conversation was fractured. Some embraced it warmly, others rejected it. But Ford showed up. He still had it, the physicality, the humor, the battered dignity. The years hadn't stolen those things. Then The Force Awakens in 2015 brought Han Solo back, and something remarkable happened. The scene between Ford and Adam Driver, Han Solo and Kylo Ren, father and son, love and betrayal, landed with devastating emotional weight. Ford played it with total commitment and zero feeling. Han Solo's death hit audiences like a genuine loss because Ford made it real. He didn't coast on legacy. He earned the moment. And here's the truth underneath what Harrison Ford actually was. He was never the most technically celebrated actor of his generation. He didn't collect Oscars. What he had was something rarer, something absolutely unshakable. Every character he played felt like a real human being caught in extraordinary circumstances, reacting the way a real human being actually would, frightened, frustrated, determined, occasionally wrong. That quality doesn't come from training alone. It comes from living, from a decade of rejection, from carpentry and survival, from understanding what it means to keep going when the world tells you to stop. Harrison Ford's story isn't just about the films. It's about the man who made every single one of those films possible. The man who installed doors and kept his head down and refused, absolutely refused, to disappear. Each of his era tells the same story in a different costume. The story of someone who earned it every single time. All right, that's all for today. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and see you next time.